Okay, welcome back. This is lecture 5 on the Indus script and the decipherment thereof. And today is going to be a relatively short presentation because we're going to focus on one aspect of decipherment that I did mention already in lecture 4, which was this notion of language typology. And just to refresh your memory, if you've forgotten what that means. So typology is an important branch of linguistics that studies features that languages have that distinguish them from other languages. And I don't just mean the fact that all languages sound different as far as their words, but languages have, for example, different ways in which they typically order the subject, the verb, and the direct object. I think we mentioned this before. Some languages like English tend to be SVO, meaning they tend to order them subject, verb, object, whereas a language like Tamil is SOV, subject, object, verb. And in fact, most modern South Asian languages are SOV. So canonical word order is an important typological consideration. So we're going to ask the question, try to answer the question, as to whether the Indus script and the Indus corpus in general have any evidence about maybe the typological characteristics of the language encoded in the inscriptions. Now, this is a bit challenging because the inscriptions are so brief. If we had longer texts, like let's say texts that had long paragraphs or the equivalent of paragraphs, however that was written, that would be written in the language, it would be easier to discern typological characteristics, things like word order. If you have inscriptions that are too short to have a subject, a verb, and an object, for example, you can't really make any statements about the relative ordering of those three elements. So we'll have to see. So let's have a look at some of the data here. And here are some typical features of typology. We've mentioned most of these already, but just by way of review, you can see canonical word order, which I've already mentioned, particularly the relative ordering of subject, object, and verb. Affix type, whether or not the language tends to use prefixes versus postfixes. Of course, English is a prefixing language, like most European languages, but many languages are not. Many languages, to the extent that they have affixation, will tend to tack the affix onto the end, and those are usually called postfixes. And then, also adpositional type, whether we have prepositions or postpositions. So prepositions are little words. And in English, we tend to say, from the city to my house. But in some languages, they would say the city from, or my house to, or something like that. Those are postpositions. And those are also typological characteristics. Most languages tend to use one or the other. A few, like German, while being primarily prepositional, does have a few postpositions, like entlang, which means along in German. That typically goes after the thing that it modifies. Okay, types of morphological agreement are interesting. Do you have, for example, a gender agreement? Do you have agreement between adjective and noun with regard to number? So if the noun is in the plural number, does the adjective need to be in the number in the plural as well? Or agreement between subject and verb? Are there different endings that you tack on the verb depending on what the subject is? Or in the case of ergative languages, does the verb agree with the object? So these are all interesting, and we're not going to go into all the details. There are lots of interesting books about language typology that can explain this kind of thing. Morphosyntactic type. Is the language inflectional? Is it agglutinative? Is it isolating? Is it polysynthetic? These terms have reference to the way that words are formed. An inflectional language is a language that typically uses roots that by themselves are never found in isolation as words, but are only realized with endings attached to them, in effect. So most Indo-European languages are inflectional, at least originally were. I mean, modern English is Indo-European, but it has very few inflectional forms. Agglutinative refers to languages that somewhat similar to inflectional languages, except that in agglutinative you typically have a word that can be found in isolation in some kind of direct case, the nominative case or whatever. And then all of the other noun cases, you just tack on endings, sometimes very long endings. And sometimes there'll be one ending for number, one ending for case, one ending for gender, and they'll all be strung together. Languages of this sort, of which Tamil is a good example, the Dravidian languages in general are agglutinative, so is Turkish and the other Turkic languages. Finnish is also agglutinative, all of the Uralic languages are. So this is a language type that's quite common in interior Eurasia, and oftentimes you end up with very, very long words. Tamil, it's possible to put together words with as many as 8 or 9 separate morphemes all strung together into one long word. Isolating languages are the opposite. English is mostly isolating. The various Chinese languages are almost entirely isolating, meaning, in effect, they don't tack on endings at all. Every word is kind of a unit unto itself. And finally, polysynthetic. These are mostly Aboriginal languages of enormous complexity. Most of the Native American languages before the arrival of Europeans, as well as most of the Aboriginal languages of Australia, were of this type. And these are languages that are like agglutinative, but even more so. They're so complex that to be able to speak them properly is to neologize. In other words, it is very common in polysynthetic languages to create brand new words every time you speak. And the few surviving languages that still are fully polysynthetic, like Inuktitut, the language of the Inuit people, or the Eskimos, if you will, of the far north. This ability is highly prized. A number of polysynthetic languages still exist, but no longer have polysynthesis. So, for example, the Cree language of Canada, and actually it's a complex of languages. So many modern-day speakers of Cree, if you go up to the various Cree reservations in the Canadian North, Manitoba, for example, you'll hear Cree spoken. It's spoken by maybe as many as 200,000 people, various types of Cree, Swampy Cree and Plains Cree and so forth and so on. But most younger speakers no longer are able to speak polysynthetically. So the language has actually changed morphosyntactically, and it's adopted the more isolating patterns of English, because almost all younger Cree speakers are also fluent in English, whereas older people can still use polysynthesis, and that means in effect that they can speak words so complex that one word is an entire sentence. So it incorporates not only all of the endings, the inflectional endings of a noun, let's say, but it even includes the verb or the predicate in one single word. So these languages are pretty much unlearnable unless you happen to be born into a culture that speaks these languages. Or in the case of, I remember the case of one couple that I heard of who lived for something like 30 years in Baffin Island and managed to master Inuktitut in that time. But polysynthetic languages, for the most part, are spoken by small numbers of people, usually by Aboriginal communities, not always. There are a few outside of the New World in Australia. Sora, one of the Munda languages of India, is often reckoned a polysynthetic language. Georgian is borderline polysynthetic. It's probably very, very agglutinative, but it's some people also claim that Georgian, the language of Georgia, the Caucasian language, is polysynthetic. Anyway, these are morphosyntactic types. I don't want to digress into a lecture on linguistics, but these are the kinds of things that, in theory at least, given enough textual information, enough data, you could, without knowing the underlying language, simply by observing patterns of sign occurrence, be able to draw inferences about the typology of the underlying language. And this, as we shall see, is a significant fact because of the various potential candidate languages that we mentioned earlier in South Asia, namely Indo-Aryan and Dravidian in particular. There are some significant typological differences, at least in the older forms of these languages. Modern-day Indo-Aryan languages have tended to converge morphosyntactically with Dravidian. So if you look at the grammar of modern-day Hindi or Sinhala or Oriya or pretty much any of the Indo-Gujarati, any of the Indo-Aryan languages spoken in South Asia, they have adopted features, morphosyntactic features of Dravidian that were not present in earlier forms of Indo-Aryan, particularly Middle Indo-Aryan and earlier Indo-Aryan languages like Sanskrit and Pali. So we're talking primarily about the early forms and what we would expect to see. All right. So the first question we might ask is, do the Indus inscriptions offer any clues about the typology of the underlying language? Well, look at the data sets here, particularly set 1. This is very striking. Set 1, the first 3 examples of set 1, this one here, MH1013, etc. We've seen this inscription before, as with the one following, MH2600, etc. These two are very common inscriptions that occur by themselves. In other words, they're essentially autonomous inscriptions, whatever they may mean, found abundantly on seals and other similar objects. This one is also a common inscription. We haven't encountered this previously. MH2144. Again, the etc. in each case means that they occur more than once. So this isn't a single seal. This actually occurs, this first inscription, I believe, more than a dozen times as such. And ditto for this one here and this one here. But now look at MH4335, etc., which I think in this case the etc., if memory serves, stands for a total of 12 inscriptions. And this is the inscription right here. Now, if you look at this carefully, you can see that it has it analyzed as follows. First of all, it starts off with a typical M field right here, an oval sign and a single fish sign. So there's the M field, which we indicated earlier probably denotes some sort of unit, some sort of mensuration, some sort of metrology, a notation of assets, or some kind of transactional record. Okay, that. And then look at what follows. First, we have these two signs, which we've seen here. Notice that the sign at the end, the so-called jar sign, always occurs at the end, right? So it seems to be, whatever its function is, it's something apart from the C field that precedes it, okay? Well, here's one. And then right next to it, we have this one. Well, that's a familiar one too, because it's here. And then we have this one, which corresponds to here. And then finally, a jar sign at the end. So what does this look like? What it looks like is that we're taking these 3 things here, these 3 C fields, this one, and this one, and this one, and we're in effect glomming them together. For want of a more precise word, we use the verb glom, okay? And this looks very much like what we're doing is forming a compound, especially if we assume, and I think the assumption is warranted, that these brief inscriptions, whatever their specific purport, are more likely to consist of nouns, specifically titles and names and perhaps even place names, things like this. And so we have a series of probable nouns or, that are put together into a single compound. All right. And if we look at set number 2, we see something similar. In this case, we see this very common inscription. There are dozens of occurrences of this, of which this thing here is the C field. And so in some sense is autonomous and certainly distinct from, again, this jar sign. And then we see this one, another very common inscription. And then in MH1010, the two of them are, again, put together to form a compound C field. And of course, we won't be confused by this P field here. We recognize that as a P field now, and there's a juncture there. So this is something apart. So again, we see 2 separate sign fields whose general sense is likely to be a noun, nominal, rather than verbal, being put together. So a little less dramatic than this example up here, but especially given the fact that this one is repeated so many times. But nonetheless, very striking. And similarly in set 3, we say the same thing. Once again, this is a familiar piece, but in this time we have this C field from another inscription, and then a third inscription that once again gloms the two together, if you will, into what looks like a noun compound. Well, why is this significant? It's significant because it tells us that in all likelihood, the underlying language is susceptible to forming noun compounds. And that's a very significant typological datum, as we shall see further on. All right? So let's look at this a little more deeply. Well, this is what we just said. I guess I kind of jumped the gun a little bit, but here is the analysis. If you want to go back and review this slide later, you can see it says essentially the same thing. If you missed that explanation that we went over, what we're seeing here in the case of the final inscription of each of these sets, we're seeing what looks like a noun compound of some sort. All right, let's move on. Not only that, the two lexeme signs, the spoked wheel sign and the chevron diamond sign, which we've identified previously as being full logographs, meaning they must designate an entire word or lexeme. We've shown that in previous lectures. So if you have any doubt, I think we talked about that in lecture 3 and also lecture 4. We discussed why this must be the case. But quickly for review, notice that these signs can occur all by themselves in a P field with naught but a, or by themselves, period, with nothing else, but with naught other than a juncture sign left adjacent. And so the conclusion that comes ineluctably from this is that these two signs, as well as several others that we've seen in P fields that we'll talk about later, that these two signs must represent full lexemes or words by themselves. So what does it say when we see a situation like here in MH 9091? Again, we have a recognizable P field here. There's the juncture sign, and then there's the other thing that goes after it. But we have, in addition to this lexeme, we have two other signs after it. Okay? And we see it again here, this pattern. The juncture sign in this case is a single tick, but the same kind of thing. And we see this same sign in the spoked wheel in combination with other signs, like here and here. We could argue that these are all separate words, but in fact, if we do the homework and trace out, for example, this sign here, we will see that it never occurs by itself. So this sign, whatever its purport is, we will offer a reading later on, but that would be premature at this point. But this sign must be something simpler, some kind of a simple syllable sign. It does not denote a full lexeme, okay? And ditto for this sign here. So what we seem to be seeing is compounds involving a full, like a full word here. So again, evidence for basically noun compounds. If this is a noun of some sort, then presumably it's compounding with other words to form compounds. And we see something similar with the diamond chevron sign, with the interesting difference that the diamond chevron sign, you'll notice in compound situations, here it is with that same sign that looks like a man holding a bow, but in this case, it's always the last member of the sequence. Look at that. Last except for the juncture sign, see? Here, this expression here, ICIT 1114, ICIT, by the way, stands for the Internet the Interactive Concordance of Indus Texts, the online thing. So this is quite similar in some ways to this one over here, MH9091, in that they both have a Bowman sign in the P field, the P field, the first field. But in this case, here notice the spoked wheel sign actually occurs initially, as it does here as well. But here it occurs as the final element, right? And then you have the juncture sign. And that same pattern repeats here in 1553. It occurs as the last element. And here it is again as actually it occurs a number of times here. This is a standalone inscription. And here it is again. And here it is again. Notice the final one. And here it is yet again and again and again. All these examples where this sign is occurring also in conjunction with other signs. We know that this sign is a word unto itself, and it seems very likely that in many cases it is forming a compound with other similar words, perhaps not noun compounds. And if these be names or titles of some sort, then these are names or titles which are formed in effect of compound nouns. All right? So I set that forth as a hypothesis that this is what's going on. And later we'll see, when we get around to deciphering both of these two signs, that this is indeed the case. All right. Now, gemination, or doubling of a sign, is a special type of compounding. And this is interesting also, because if gemination of the sign is gemination of a word, then that's an interesting typological datum as well. Here's another one of the signs that's frequently found in the P field, this thing that looks like a sort of like a truncated crescent moon or something like that. And notice how it's often found by itself with just a juncture sign, usually this juncture sign here, by the way, left adjacent, though not always. And then it does occasionally occur in geminate form, and that's kind of interesting. That's an interesting fact, and it's also the fact that the spoked wheel sign occurs as a geminate in a number of places. Now, why is this significant? Because gemination is a feature, a typological feature of many languages, but it occurs in different ways. So, for example, in ancient Indo-Aryan, it occurred in Sanskrit, where they would literally double the word. Some of these may be familiar to modern speakers of Indo-Aryan because the words have come down to us. For example, Raja Raja, which is gemination of the word Raja, which means king. Raja Raja means something like highest king or greatest king or something like that. So we find Raja Raja. Another one that occurs is Deva Deva, which is a geminate form of the word Deva, which means God. So Deva Deva means like highest God or something like that. It's an emphatic way of saying it. Also, some forms that are no longer used but will be familiar to students of the Rig Veda. Forms like dive dive and ahar ahar, which both mean day by day. So those are common. And there are quite a few others as well. This type of gemination is true gemination where the word is literally doubled. In the case of Sanskrit, it usually has either an emphatic sense or replicative sense, as in day by day. All right. In a language like modern-day Bahasa Indonesia or Indonesian, it's used to form the plural, right? So, for example, in Indonesian, kucing means cat. Kucing kucing means cats. Okay. So that's pretty much the standard way that they pluralize. Gedung means building. Gedung means buildings in Indonesian. So that's not uncommon for certain language groups to use gemination to express plural. Now, there is a form of gemination that occurs in the Dravidian languages as well, but it's not a truly replicative gemination. What they do instead is they have a canonical syllable that they use to replace the first syllable. And it has a very colloquial sense, right? So, for example, in Tamil, that syllable is ki. So the word vandi in Tamil means car. And if you say vandi kindi, where you replace the first syllable va with ki, it means cars and such. Or cars, you know what I mean, or something like that. So it's not seen very much in the written language, but it's quite frequent in the spoken language. And all of the Dravidian languages have this kind of canonical syllable. Some of the modern Indo-Aryan languages, like Hindi even, have adopted a similar strategy where they have a funny little syllable, a substitutive syllable that they use for gemination. So anyway, this is an important fact. And the thing is, it is possible that these doubled signs, these geminate signs in the Indus script, do not actually mean geminated words or gemination in any sense of the word. They may simply happen to mean something else. And I think in some cases they do. But if they do designate actual geminate compounding, then that is also typologically a significant piece of information. All right. Now, we're going to talk about something. We mentioned adfixation earlier, affixation. And I would submit to you that there is some evidence, and we'll see later that it's borne out when we actually get to the decipherment phase of all this, but some evidence in the inscriptions for prefixes. Again, prefixes are a nice thing to look at when you're dealing with such short words because, again, things like word order typology are going to be difficult to establish if it turns out that the inscriptions are just too short to show subjects, verbs, and objects. But prefixes and postfixes are going to be a feature of words of any length. So let's look at several signs that possibly may be prefixes. One of them is the long stroke double bar, which in some contexts probably denotes the number 2. But notice it occurs a number of times in absolute initial position. So it's indisputably like the first sign in a word. This is a pretty common pattern. I've showed a selection of them here. This is not exhaustive by any means. But notice how often it occurs at the very beginning of a word, all right? In this case, obviously, it's not the only word in the inscription, but it's the first thing. So that's a significant fact, I think. And of course, in this inscription here, we also have the double bar next to the fish sign, and that's something quite different, as we've already seen. This is actually a fish compound right here. But here it is, and this is a rather common sequence, by the way. It occurs in at least 5 or 6 different inscriptions. So this is a significant thing. So the long stroke number 2 seems to be acting like a prefix in many cases. It does not always occur in word initial position, but what it may well be is some kind of a syllable or sound sequence that happens to coincide with a prefix, even though it may be found elsewhere on occasion. All right. Here's another interesting example. This funny little sign that sort of looks like a dude holding maybe a bow or something, or a spear. It's hard to tell what this is exactly. But this is a rather common sign, and as events transpire, it will turn out to be a very important sign, preview of coming attractions. But for now, we note that of its many occurrences, a very significant number are in word initial position. And of particular interest, as we shall see, I'm not going to reveal too much now, but is its predilection to occur in absolute initial position adjacent to one, or in some cases 2, of those that funny aforementioned crescent moon sign, which we know denotes a lexeme of some sort. All right, so here it is again. We've mentioned this inscription already, by the way, as a nice example of a complex inscription. And later on, I will give you a full reading of this inscription, and it's absolutely revelatory as far as Indus culture is concerned. In this case, you see a couple of examples where it occurs in initial position, except for some kind of stroke numeral. And in this case, these are short stroke, so I think there's little doubt that these are in fact numerals of some sort. So aside from the numeral, it appears to be occurring in initial position. And here's an example where it's not in initial position, but you can see there's a clear segmentation there, because here we have this very familiar sign. There's a C field followed by the T field with this, and then a brand new field after it. All right. So anyway, so in many, many instances, though not all, this sign does seem to occur in prefix-like contexts. And here's a third example, another very important sign, as it will turn out, that also does not exclusively occur in obvious prefix-type situation, but it does occur often enough in absolute initial, or in this case, relative initial, because here you have this sign pair that we've seen before that seems to be something unto itself, and then whatever follows begins with this word. That's again this mysterious inscription M3105 that I promise you is going to be highly significant. It's going to be one of the most important discoveries, in fact, of this entire decipherment process. Okay, so the distributional evidence suggests that the Indus language may have had the following features. It may have had noun compounding, noun gemination, and prefixing. Now that's not a lot to go on, but these are significant because all of these are robust features of early Indo-Aryan, and none of them are features of Dravidian, at least in the form that Dravidian has come down to us. Now, the very earliest forms of Tamil that have come down to us probably date from the mid-1st millennium BC, so roughly 1,000 years after the collapse of the Harappan civilization. And it could be argued that the Dravidian, Proto-Dravidian, may have changed its typology significantly. Languages do this. And so it's possible that even though all forms of Dravidian that have come down to us, from the earliest forms of Tamil to all the modern languages, are postfixing rather than prefixing, do not have pure noun gemination in any sense of the word, and do not allow noun compounding in any form. It may well be that in an earlier phase of the language, it may have had those features. But as far as the data available to us, these three typological features are very much characteristic not only of early Indo-Aryan, but of Indo-European generally. And so that's, perhaps an interesting thing. And it does tell us, I would say, at very least, that we should not so lightly discard the Indo-Aryan hypothesis, as has been the wont of researchers since the 1930s, when the Dravidian hypothesis first came into vogue. So that's all, I believe, for this presentation. Yes, that's all for this presentation. We're going to stop there. I think that's a digestible amount of information worth considering. None of this evidence taken by itself is conclusive, but in the next lecture, we're going to talk about other types of evidence from the inscriptions themselves and how they square with this typological evidence and maybe help additionally to point a suggestive finger in the direction that we ought to be looking.